Good afternoon, everyone in Science and Values. This is going to be the only lecture video that I provide this week. Uh, I'm not necessarily going to cover everything that you had to read for this week. There was an additional reading from a large PDF on Canvas titled Ethics and Practice in Scientific Communication. And then I wanted you to read one of the chapters from that text, as it does go along with some of the same themes from the Eliot reading. There will be some terminology that I want to introduce initially, some distinctions that I want to talk about that aren't necessarily in the reading itself. But this is going to be less of a lecture and more of a kind of free-flowing discussion that I'm going to have. Um, that I'm going to, kind of put some things out there and see what you think of them. And the reason I say that is because what I'm going to be discussing in this video is extremely timely. I mean, everything we're discussing in this course is, but this topic in particular is something that I think a lot about. Um, and it has to do with, uh, so to review, this is sort of the third week in a row in the course that we're focusing on the theme of uncertainty in science. First week, we dealt with uncertainty um, in a particular context, and then last week we dealt with uncertainty in a particular context. The first week we dealt with simply how to communicate uncertainty. If there is uncertainty in the results, uh, but yet there is potentially a demand that we communicate those results because of the nature of the problem that's being studied, because the public needs access to information in order to help them potentially avoid problematic behaviors. So they need access to the information. And so a scientist has to kind of figure out how can they frame the information and communicate the information to get it out there, but yet also make people aware that the information is not conclusive. So trying to achieve a balance between those demands. And then last week we dealt with not just in the communication of results themselves, but specifically when a scientist is setting up their study, setting up their hypothesis, setting up their research design. What standard of evidence are they going to settle upon to be satisfied with the results that they get? And Eliot argues, and relying on Douglas, they argue that values have a legitimate role to play even there when a scientist is setting a standard of evidence. Because this is related to the previous topic that it may be the case that a lower standard of evidence is justified if public health or public safety demands that something be done about the problem. So a lower standard of evidence might be demanded in certain cases. And there, it's the value that's driving that decision to set the standard of evidence at a particular spot. Similarly, in other cases, and maybe most of the time, the standard of evidence should be kept as high as possible to maintain scientific integrity. And so, balancing what I've been emphasizing throughout, it's balancing scientific, um, scientific values such as accuracy, testability, reliability, things that I've been referring to as epistemic values related to knowledge acquisition, that we expect scientists to uphold certain epistemic values in their work. It goes along with what it means to be a scientist. At the same time, scientists are having to figure out how to balance the need to communicate their results with not only considering this desire to be correct and give the correct information, they're also needing to communicate their results in such a way that they accommodate this other set of values, which are moral values and social values. And so scientists, this goes back to the beginning of the course, but that the argument, I think, one of the most compelling arguments that I find in the Eliot text is there are going to be value influences on scientists when it comes to how they should communicate their results. And the question is, should they acknowledge those value influences or not? It seems like the obvious answer is, well, yes, you should acknowledge the value influences and try to incorporate them into your research in appropriate ways, being transparent and engaging with others in order to decide about how those values should be incorporated. So we've looked at that. And so today's reading deals specifically with the attempt by individuals to actually generate uncertainty intentionally, to put information out there that they claim is science and that can compete with actual science in order to generate doubt in the public's mind about the truth of science. And the easiest example to see this with is climate change. Eliot discusses so in today's book on in the reading you had from the Eliot text this week was short. It's only 6 pages, but Eliot, going back to the 1980s, Eliot discusses the Marshall Institute and how this was an organization, a kind of think tank that was founded, and their goal and their mission was to generate doubt about climate change. If you recall, James Hansen from one of the earlier chapters was giving this testimony about climate change in the 1980s. And so a lot of climate scientists agree, those who study climate science agree that going back to the 1980s was really when the world had a chance really to do something about climate change, that the emissions numbers hadn't gotten so bad, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, that there was a chance to reverse the trends in a significant way. Had we taken significant action during the 1980s, and here you see, similarly during the 1980s, you see this group called the Marshall Institute that comes along, and their goal and their purpose was to generate doubt, to generate uncertainty. Referencing another campaign in the reading, it was the tobacco industry, who fought hard against groups that were trying to, show links between lung cancer and cigarettes. So the tobacco industry famously declares that doubt is their product. And one of the interesting things about the generation of uncertainty by industries, well, obviously they stand to lose a lot of money if certain activities are regulated. So the primary motivation is an economic one. That if people are scared about smoking and you tell them that it causes lung cancer or makes them sick, they're not going to buy cigarettes, and so there's a lot of money to be lost. So similarly, the fossil fuel industry engages in this practice as well. There's a lot of money to be lost if the gas-powered vehicle is no longer going to be the primary mode of transportation, and so there's just a lot of money to be lost, and so these industries have to fight back. And they have to generate doubt and generate uncertainty. So they are, not only are they, they're actually, they have their own scientists, they have their own research that they put out there that they suggest can compete with the actual research that's done by scientists. And so the public is just in a state of confusion. There's so much information being thrown at them, so much out there that they don't know what to believe. And this really gets to the heart of, if you think about now during the pandemic, I mean, it's a similar state of affairs, that there seems to be so much information out there that, you don't know what to believe. You don't know who, a credible source of authority is. And this is the result of many decades of these kinds of campaigns to sow doubt and to sow distrust in science itself. And so, in some ways, this is the worst possible time to distrust science and to distrust scientific authority when literally the results of doing so could cost you your life. So we're, some would say, with climate change, there's not this immediacy to climate change, even though in some ways there is an immediacy to climate change. But for most, at least, who live in the United States, it's a kind of out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And so there isn't an immediacy to distrusting the science and to, just engaging in the same kinds of behaviors that we normally do. Basically, our kind of developed capitalistic lifestyles that we engage in, where the primary activity we engage in is consumption, buying as much as we can and eating as much as we can and just consuming, basically the typical American consumer lifestyle. Which I'm not making a judgment about that. I'm saying that you know when it comes to climate change, the distrust in scientific authority, there's no immediacy, and so people are less likely to be convinced. Whereas with something like a pandemic, and people are dying every day, the consequences for not trusting the science and believing in the science are deeply, deeply troubling and problematic. And so I kind of just want to think about this, even though in some ways it may just make you angry, it may make you mad. That especially you all as students who study science, who want to become doctors and scientists, that you live, you're living in a time where you say it's science, it's not politics, it's not about politics. And I remember when I was in college, I had a bumper sticker I put on the back of my car that said it's science, not politics, right? And that somehow it should just be that simple. That if I just give you the right information, then I will convince you that. And so it can be very maddening. You can feel like you're living, and I don't want to cast judgment, but you really can feel like you're surrounded by a lot of really stupid people because the science is so obvious. And yet, we continue to have large portions of the population that distrust scientific authority and scientific information. And so, I really want to think about, because what I'm sort of describing here, there's this model for thinking about why is it that that individuals continue to persist in their why is it that individuals continue to persist in their distrust of science? And you could just say they don't have access to the right information. And if you gave them the information, then they would simply believe the science. But that's clearly not the case, because the science is there. And so this is referred to as the deficit model of thinking about the gap between scientist and non-scientist. That the scientist is the expert, the public are the ignorant ones, and they simply need to be given the right information. The deficit model simply presupposes that they lack the right information, and if they're given the right information, then they will get on board with the science. But clearly this isn't the case. And so the story is much more complicated. And this is what Eliot is pointing out in today's reading, that scientific disagreement between scientists and the public, or even but not just between scientists, but between Joe and Sally, between just everyday people, that the disagreement is not rooted in a disagreement over facts. It's rooted in a disagreement over values. And Eliot comes right out and says this on page he comes right out and says this on 104. He says, "But if values are the real driving force behind many controversies, then those who aim to solve these conflicts should probably focus more on resolving value disagreements than on generating or communicating more compelling science." So it's what philosophers call, it's a normative disagreement. It is not an epistemic disagreement. An epistemic disagreement would simply be related to knowledge, and that's simply that we disagree about the facts, and so we disagree about knowledge, and that's why it's epistemic. But in fact, scientific disagreement is rooted in our values, which is to say, it is related to normative disagreements. And normative is a broad encompassing term in philosophy, but normative refers to value-oriented questions, such as morality. What is the best way to live your life? Politics. What should government do and what shouldn't government do? So morality and politics are both very value-laden spheres of human existence. Religion is another one. Value-laden spheres. And disagreements in science, if we cling to the deficit model, we will just be stuck in an endless cycle of anger and frustration with seemingly a group of experts and a group of ignorant idiots. And that model is so unhelpful for thinking about how to resolve these disagreements. How can we try and get individuals, one, to trust scientists, but maybe they won't even trust scientists, but to at least engage in behaviors and actions that aren't going to threaten your and my life, especially during a pandemic. And so that is something that I wanted to touch on, is that disagreement about scientific information is rooted in values, not facts. And so given that it is more of a normative disagreement and less of an epistemic disagreement, what should we do about it? How do we appeal to values, people's values that they hold, rather than just facts? And just let me give you a few more examples. So Eliot gives some of these examples in the book, and it might be helpful to think about that. So for example, when it comes to climate change, the reason that people are so afraid to believe that climate change is occurring is because it threatens their very way of life. Imagining the fact that a lot of people agree that in order to solve at this point might just be, not even possible, but in order to mitigate or make the problem, less bad, climate change, it's agreed that governments are going to have to do something about it. It can't be the private sector. It can't be left up to the market to simply solve climate change. That it's going to require large-scale governmental policy, which means regulation of certain industries. And so clearly, if you are of a certain political leaning, you have a value orientation that suggests that the government should and shouldn't do specific things. And therefore, it doesn't matter how much information I give you about climate change. It doesn't matter. Your life is guided by a value orientation that suggests the government is bad when it comes to doing certain things, that your freedom and that your rights are more important, and therefore government, again, it's kind of government bad, and freedom and rights are good, and so so that's an easy example. What about vaccines? Well, a lot of these are religious. The opposition to vaccine research is rooted in values too, and it might not be necessarily religious, but that you're worried about, you're scared of your little newborn infant having to be subjected to getting a sharp needle stuck in their arm, and so it's more of a fear-based thing. And so the question is, how do we deal with this? I mean, even now during the pandemic, we've got people who don't want to wear a mask, and I think and I hope, in this case at least, the opposition to masks is not as significant as climate change, because it doesn't. There are attempts to politicize the wearing of a mask, but my sense, at least increasingly, is that that attempt to politicize it is just seen for what it is, and many people are seeing through it and they're wearing a mask. And again, it may not be because they believe the science, it's simply because they fear the consequences of not doing so. And so, but nonetheless, there are people that persist in this belief, and the question is, what do we do about it? How do you communicate science in an ethically and morally responsible way that doesn't only appeal to facts? Because you may think of the scientist as simply the dispenser of information. But of course, that's not the case. We have scientists who have to try and convince individuals to engage in certain actions that scare them, that go against their fundamental beliefs about what the government should and shouldn't do, how they should and shouldn't live their lives. When you get into the should and the shouldn't, and the scientists are simply, so the scientists are telling us what is and isn't, but human beings are thinking about what, should and shouldn't. So the is and the isn't and the should and the shouldn't, there's going to be you're trying to solve a normative problem with an empirical solution, and it's just not going to work. Not entirely. And so the question is, how do we, and so this gets into the other argument in today's reading from the larger text that by this lady by the name of Susanna Priest. And she's, her argument, she talks about two ways of communication. This applies to science, it applies to journalism, but broadly speaking, there are two categories of communication. There is strategic communication, where when you've got the speaker and the listener, and the speaker's goal is to get the listener to do something, to act on the information that they're being given. So that is strategic communication. There's also, and this goes along with just the kind of governmental system that we have, there's also just democratic communication, which is to say, I don't want you necessarily to do anything. I want to give you information, as much information as possible, so that you can make up your mind for yourself what you want to do. And that goes along with respecting individual rights and freedoms. That goes along with, some of the norms and the values of living in a democracy. That there's something anti-democratic about an expert telling you what you should do. That's the anti-democratic sense. And so democratic communication it's not that there aren't experts and non-experts, but the goal of the expert is simply to give you information to empower you to choose what you want to do for yourself. And Priest is kind of thinking about this distinction and whether it would be appropriate for scientists to engage in strategic communication, to get individuals to do something. And of course, it happens all the time, but the question is, I think the question is democratic communication ever merely democratic? Or is it sort of, is democratic communication being cloaked as a kind of strategic communication? That, yes, I'm giving you this information to empower you, but I'm also hoping that once I give you the information, you'll go out and do something with it. So it's not neutral. I'm not just giving you the information and I'm saying do what you want with it. I'm also hoping you will do this particular thing with it. So when I give you the information about mask wearing during the pandemic, I'm not saying, well, now that I've given you this information, you can go ahead and choose or not choose to wear a mask. I'm saying, here's the information. I'm empowering you, the individual, to make the choice about what to do with it. I'm also like, I want you to wear the freaking mask, I'm not just giving you the information. And so, while democratic communication might seem like an ideal that we should strive for, it's not always clear that in practice. And so philosophers often talked about a conceptual distinction. There may be a conceptual distinction between strategic and democratic communication, but in practice, it might be the case that everything almost starts to look like strategic communication. So the question is, what are the ethical limits of strategic communication? Because One of the concerns with strategic communication is that I'm taking away your autonomy. I'm taking away your freedom to make a decision for yourself. And so strategic communication fundamentally has a kind of ethical question attached to it. Anytime you're engaged in strategic communication, you have to ask, are you undermining the autonomy of the listener to make a decision for themselves? And there's going to be a spectrum about how to think about this. There's a broad spectrum on how to think about this. And it really depends upon the immediacy and the urgency of the situation. If we're talking about a pandemic, and I ask you this in this week's homework, if we're talking about a pandemic and look, half the people I go out and see, if you go to a restaurant during the pandemic, there's 50 people in there you'll never see again in your life potentially. But in a pandemic, there is this kind of social contract that I'm dependent upon you and you're dependent upon me to engage in the same behavior, because public health is something that we all share. It's a public good. And so when the threat is immediate, it seems like we might say that strategic communication on the part of a scientist is much more justified. That concerns about autonomy and freedom when it comes to strategic communication are not really that significant. That I'm not really all that worried about your freedom and your rights to have access to the right information. It's simply going to be because now again, I can't just give you the information. The question is, how do I do it? Right? So we still have the same problem. It's still a normative empirical gap, but yet I'm not concerned about giving you the right information because I'm not worried about your autonomy. So the question is then, do I manipulate you? Do I scare you? Do I just put the statistics in front of you and show that people are dying? Do I send you a YouTube clip of Dr. Anthony Fauci? I mean, how do I do it? How do I engage in it, right? And so when the disagreements are about values, I have to meet you on the same plane. Otherwise, we're not even having a conversation. I have to treat it as a normative disagreement and less as a factual disagreement. So the question is, how do I appeal to your values and not simply to your facts? I have to meet you on that plane. So how do I do it? Do I try to scare you? Well, I think the evidence is there that if you try to scare somebody, they're probably going to be very resistant. Psychologically, there's probably a lot of empirical evidence yes, scaring people, they're going to be resistant to attempts to scare them. They're not going to respond to fear-based attempts. So simply showing them death, the amount of death that has resulted from the pandemic is probably not going to convince them, because chances are you're still appealing to like statistics there to some extent, and they're probably going to be resistant. They're going to say, well, there's so many numbers out there. You've got some agencies say this, some agencies say this. What counts as a case, right, during the pandemic? What doesn't count as a case? And so they're not going to be. So the question is like, how do you appeal to them? And well, I don't know. I think about Clemson's recent Instagram post. Clemson, in the attempt to try to bring students back to campus, they put a student in front of you all, a fellow student with a mask on, and that is their attempt. I mean, they want you to engage in the right behavior, but they're still trying to show you that, look, somebody like you is willing to do this. Shouldn't you be willing to do the same? And so images can be very powerful. Images appeal to our emotions. So it's not merely a fact-based campaign. So anyways, this is getting about a half hour here, and I don't want to say too much more, but I just want to review a little bit of the big points. First of all, I want to just highlight the big distinctions that I want you to think about. The fact that scientific disagreement is rooted not in epistemic and empirical disagreement, but in normative disagreement, largely speaking. If it was simply rooted in epistemic and empirical disagreement, then it would seem like the phenomenon of denying scientific phenomena would be much less. So there must be something more going on. So it's a disagreement about values, about the way that the world and the government should and shouldn't be. Getting down to your very ways of being and ways of your life, about the way you want the world to look, the world you want to raise your children in. That's where the disagreement is coming from. That's very different than simply thinking about, this ignorant, stupid person. Now you've got somebody who's a who's a living, human, breathing human being who has a lot of concerns about the world that they want their children growing up in. And treating them like that, as a scared human being who doesn't know about the world rather than a stupid, ignorant person, is much different. So I want to start with that distinction. And then there's this distinction between strategic and um, democratic communication, and the concern that strategic communication undermines autonomy, right? And yet, when there's the immediacy of a scientific, emergency, when there's a public health emergency, the concern about undermining autonomy is not really as much of a concern. That can be overridden by the harm that is done as a result of, not engaging in the appropriate behaviors like wearing a mask. And one other, thing to say is, one way to try to solve these value disagreements, please watch that Vox video, the link with the Vox video, that talks about how scientists are actually really bad at communicating. They're not the best ones to try to communicate. And in fact, it tells a story of a guy who had to go and meet with the Pope, and how after the Pope spoke about climate change in moral terms rather than simply in scientific terms, when the Pope talked about climate change as a moral problem, how the belief among Catholics in climate change rose dramatically after hearing it from the Pope, somebody who shares their values. And so maybe the solution is finding somebody of an authority, who shares their values, who shares their politics, who shares their religion, to get to speak to them. That might be a way of convincing them. So anyways, that's all I have. I really do hope you've taken the time to watch this, because I do think this chapter about generating uncertainty, and then how to communicate science is so extremely timely. Frustrating, maybe you're tired of hearing about it, but also extremely timely. And that's something I want you to think about.